A gray morning settled like fog over St. Raymond's Liberal Arts University, casting a dull sheen across the glass-paneled courtyard where students trudged in layered jackets, coffee cups steaming in their hands. Inside the Philosophy of Reason auditorium, a hush settled as Professor Ethan Granger adjusted his blazer with surgical precision. Flipping through a stack of annotated lecture notes with a kind of cold reverence, his eyes scanned the rows of undergraduates trickling into their seats, mostly juniors and seniors, all conditioned by his reputation for brilliance and for cruelty. His voice sliced through the room with the crispness of someone who never feared being challenged. Without preamble, he began, launching into a monologue on the irrationality of belief systems. His words laced with intellectual contempt, his cadence, sharp and surgical, danced across historic examples, misquoting spiritual texts and mocking theological thought. It wasn't the first time. Most students had grown numb to it, some even amused. But today, there was a shift. In the back row, someone sat motionless, an older man, late 40s or 50s, dressed in muted gray, no notebook, no laptop, hands folded in his lap as though in prayer. The moment Granger's eyes locked onto him, the tone changed. A grin tugged at the professor's mouth. Whispers began among the students, fragmented and low. A few recognized the man, Jonathan Roumie, known not just as an actor, but as the one who played Jesus in a globalist-streamed series. Yet here, he sat as a student, an anomaly in a sea of youth, his stillness pulling attention like a gravitational field. Granger's voice dropped into theatrical curiosity. "Mr. Roumie," he began, letting the name float in the air. "You're the actor who played Jesus, aren't you?" There was a pause. The students turned as one. Roumie looked up slowly, not with surprise, but with measured calm. "I'm just a student today," he said with a gentle smile. Granger's eyebrow arched. "Believer, then?" Silence stretched. Jonathan's eyes didn't waver. The air felt like glass ready to shatter. "I believe in truth," he said. A few students chuckled. One or two looked uneasy, but the smirk never left Granger's face. He turned back to his lectern, using the moment as a springboard into a longer tirade. Time, more pointed. He likened faith to superstition, argued that logic alone sustained civilization, cited neuroscience studies and misrepresented them for effect. His voice rang louder now, feeding off the discomfort in the room. Each swipe, each analogy, spiraled closer toward Jonathan without ever naming him again. Yet Jonathan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. He absorbed the blows without reaction. Outside, raindrops began to streak the tall windows. The sound of thunder was distant but present, a low growl beneath the intellectual theater. The class ended not with a flourish, but with a loaded silence. Students filtered out in murmurs. Some glanced at Jonathan on the way. Others ignored him, but one student, Maya, stayed behind. She was a quiet presence, often unnoticed, with tightly braided hair and a worn backpack pulled over one shoulder. Her eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavier. She approached slowly, like one does in a church or a courtroom. "You didn't say anything," she said, voice almost inaudible. Jonathan turned to her, offering not a defense, but a truth. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anger. She held his gaze a second longer, then nodded. It wasn't admiration, it was understanding. They shared something wordless in awareness of what had just happened, and how many times it had happened before in other classrooms, to other people. Across the courtyard from a higher floor in the faculty lounge, Granger watched through the window. His smirk remained, but his fingers gripped the porcelain coffee mug harder than before. He said nothing, just observed as Maya and Jonathan stood under the dimming lights of a now empty hall. Later, in the lounge, as the chatter of other professors buzzed around him, Granger leaned to a colleague and spoke in a low voice. "Watch," he said. "He'll crack. They all do." The colleague didn't respond, but Granger didn't need affirmation. He had seen it before: idealists who folded, believers who trembled under scrutiny, those who claimed moral ground only to sink beneath it. What he didn't yet see was the shift, the pause in the room when Roumie had spoken, the unease that trailed some of the students as they left. Something unspoken had been planted, something not easily mocked. Jonathan stepped into the rain, coat collar turned up, walking in silence as students passed him without comment. No one knew what he was thinking, but every step he took away from that hall left a ripple in its wake. Inside, on Granger's whiteboard, the words "faith equals fear" remained underlined in red, but something about them now seemed childish, like a magician's trick after the illusion breaks. The arrogance still stood, but it trembled faintly. What had begun as another academic ambush had ended with something different, a silence that resisted interpretation. A man who answered mockery not with protest, but with poise. And though Granger couldn't name it, he felt the disturbance settling around him like the storm building out. Anonymous complaints once scrawled on official forms had been buried beneath stacks of bureaucratic procedures, quietly archived and quietly ignored. At St. Raymond's, the silence wasn't just cultural, it was administrative. There were files, dozens of them, detailing racist remarks, veiled threats, unfair evaluations. They lived in manila folders or within unread digital reports marked resolved. Names like Maya's appeared in them, students who dared to speak once and then disappeared into the machinery. Behind closed doors, the rot had grown deep, masked by polished speeches, grants, and media acclaim for free thought. But what passed as intellectual rigor, under Granger's reign, had long since decayed into a culture of fear and subtle humiliation. He called it challenging minds. Others knew better. The montage unfolded in soft flashes. Maya humiliated during a debate presentation, receiving a C with no feedback. A Muslim student whose prayer mat had been ridiculed during a lecture on superstition. An older janitor, black, soft-spoken, walking away from a spilled coffee incident, as Granger whispered loudly to another professor, "I suppose theology won't fix that mess either." No one laughed, but no one objected either. Years back, Professor Ethan Granger was a campus darling. Known for his progressive realism, he took pride in destroying what he called intellectual delusions. He became a fixture on liberal podcast panels, often citing his own classroom as proof that belief dies under scrutiny. But cynicism had crept in like rust, slowly turning satire into cruelty, questions into condemnation. Now, in a private faculty meeting, that same man paced in front of a projection screen showing Jonathan Roumie's student audit file. No grades, no paper trail, just an auditing student with unrestricted access to all lectures. Granger's voice broke the silence, laced with mockery. "Messiah complex or research project," he said, smirking at his own joke. Some laughed weakly, others shifted in their seats. In a hallway outside that very meeting, Maya and Jonathan walked together under the dull hum of fluorescent lights. Her voice was low, hesitant. "Why are you really here?" Jonathan's reply was calm, unhurried. "To witness something? You mean the system?" she asked. "No," he said, meeting her eyes. "People when they're tested." Back in the dorms, another student knocked on Jonathan's door. Diego, visibly anxious, clutched a flash drive in his hand. His words came out in bursts. He'd once filed a report against Granger for what he thought was a clear case of targeted hostility, but the administration told him it would complicate his academic future. He was offered a mentorship. Instead, nothing ever came of the complaint. "He said I lacked critical thinking," Diego muttered, "because I quoted a faith leader in a paper on ethics." Jonathan took the flash drive without saying a word. The next morning, an anonymous message swept through campus inbox as the subject line read, "Watch who you clap for." Inside were short video clips: Granger smirking as he mocked prayer during a logic lecture, another of him laughing after a student used the phrase soul. Cut between them, someone had spliced Jonathan's face, silent, composed, unflinching. He never once spoke in the clips, yet his presence changed the tone entirely. The videos weren't angry, they were unnerving. People didn't erupt in protest. They asked questions. In sociology class, a student brought up subtle pedagogical abuse without naming anyone. In the library, whispers turned into conversations. One TA was overheard saying, "I always thought he crossed lines, but I just thought that was allowed here." Momentum moved not like a wave but like a quiet undertow, pulling people slowly towards self-awareness. Granger's behavior didn't change. If anything, it grew more precise, more performative. But inside his office, alone under dim desk lighting, something fractured. He opened an email sent from an untraceable address. No subject line, just a video clip, grainy, dated 5 years back. In it, Granger stands at a lectern during an open student forum, responding to a disabled freshman who asked whether faith gave him hope. Granger's response, a sarcastic dismissal about the disabled brain being susceptible to fairy tales. The room had laughed, but now, watching it again, the laughter sounded different, hollow. He clicked pause. His reflection stared back from the dark, screen-edged, tired, but not broken, not yet. The campus atmosphere shifted. It wasn't rebellion, it was recognition. People had seen what they weren't supposed to, and it hadn't been Jonathan's voice that exposed anything. It was his refusal to retaliate, to perform, to make himself a martyr. He simply stood still while the world began noticing what it had ignored for too long. And in that silence, Granger heard something for the first time, not Jonathan, but himself. And it did not sound like reason. It sounded like shame. The email went out on a Wednesday morning, an open forum titled Faith versus Reason, set for Friday evening in the university's grand auditorium. It wasn't a surprise. The administration, desperate to show balance after the quiet campus unrest, spun it as a healthy intellectual exercise. But to many, it felt like a setup. Granger was quick to volunteer. His message to the organizing board was brief, confident, happy to represent reason. No one asked Jonathan directly, yet when the notice updated, his name appeared beside Granger's. He didn't protest. He simply nodded when students asked if he'd attend. Whispers filled the halls. Some expected a public collapse. Others just wanted to see how silence could survive the spotlight. By evening, the auditorium was full. Students leaned forward, some with phones in hand, some just watching. Faculty lined the back. A few sat with arms crossed, others with notebooks open. The lights dimmed slowly. At stage left, Professor Granger, clad in a dark blazer, index cards in one hand, a water bottle in the other. At stage right, Jonathan Roumie, seated, hands clasped on his lap, still dressed in unremarkable grays. No podium, no notes, just presence. The moderator opened with pleasantries before handing the mic to Granger. He stood and paced gently, voice modulated, like a seasoned speaker. He quoted Dawkins, referenced neurobiology, layered citations, with anecdotes. The audience chuckled on cue. His performance was precise. Then he turned toward Jonathan with a pointed gesture. Faith, Granger said, letting the word hang, is a crutch. People like him hold on to it because truth scares them. He didn't look away. Your silence isn't wisdom, he added. It's weakness. There was no gasp from the audience. Just that tightening quiet one that meant something was about to shift. Jonathan rose, slowly. No notes, no retort. His voice, when it came, was soft but sure. I want to tell you a story, he began. Narration wove gently into his words, like a melody behind a single instrument. He spoke of a child in Aleppo who prayed not for safety, but for courage. Of a man who gave his last loaf of bread to a stranger because he believed in love's echo. He didn't quote scriptures or defend religion. He offered memory, experience, stillness. Belief, he said, doesn't mean I'm right. It means I'm willing to stand when nothing else will. A hush settled. Maya, seated near the front, wiped at her eyes. The moderator began to shift in their seat, ready to move to the next question, but the silence held like tension before a storm. You can argue logic. Professor, Jonathan continued, his gaze calm, but I've seen men saved by silence, not words. And that's when it happened. From the crowd, a single voice called out, not loud, but clear. I filed a report against you last semester, a student said from the middle rows. They never responded. There was no shout, no accusation, just fact. Another voice followed. He mocked my brother's stutter in class. A third. He told me faith made me irrational. I was 12 when I lost my parents. Belief was all I had. More voices. Soft, steady, undeniable. I was told not to question his grading for my own good. He said my father's prayers were just fear disguised as culture. I stopped speaking in class after he laughed when I said love guides decisions. Each one landed like a stone in a silent pond, ripples spreading with every truth. Granger's face changed. His grip on the lectern tightened. He tried to lift the mic, but it wavered in his hand. This is turning into a reckoning, Jonathan said. Not loud, not triumphant, just real. The moderator looked around. There were no more questions, nothing left to arbitrate. The session ended not with applause, but a silence deeper than any Jonathan had ever delivered. Granger walked off stage, not defeated, not shouted down, but unseen. For the first time, no one looked at him, not even those who once revered him. All eyes were somewhere else now, on truth, on consequence, on silence that had finally spoken. ChatGPT said. Weeks passed like dust settling on a book no one wanted to reopen. The review committee moved quickly after the debate fallout, pushed not by outrage but by the irrefutable clarity of the recordings. No headlines, no press releases, just a short internal memo distributed through faculty emails. Professor Ethan Granger was being placed on indefinite leave following confirmation of unprofessional conduct patterns. No public apology, no explanation. His office was cleared on a quiet Tuesday morning. Cardboard boxes filled with decades of lecture notes, framed newspaper interviews, and books on rationalism lined the hallway as a single maintenance worker wheeled them out. Granger did not protest. He sat behind his desk for a long time after the memo, unmoving, eyes unfocused on the edges of the walls he once commanded. Students passed him in corridors without recognition. No nods, no eye contact. Some looked past him as though he had become part of the structure, inaudible, invisible. Once the revered mind of St. Raymond's, now a remnant of something people were learning to outgrow. He lingered near the parking lot longer than necessary after turning in his keys, staring at his reflection in the windshield of his car. He got in but didn't start it. Minutes passed, then more. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. In the privacy of his home that night, the glow of his laptop illuminated only his weary face. Social media feeds were flooded with debate clips, each edited by students, journalists, even strangers. Jonathan Roumie's voice had gone viral not by volume, but by gravity. The most replayed snippets showed him standing calmly as the crowd shifted behind him, saying, "Belief means standing when nothing else will." That line repeated across thousands of reposts, underlined by music, quoted in articles, etched into comment sections where people confessed what that moment had meant to them. Granger watched the clip on loop, over and over. The lighting, the silence, the weight of something collapsing inside himself with each repetition. He closed the tab, then opened it again. His phone buzzed beside him, a message from his daughter. "Are you okay?" He stared at it, typed nothing, said nothing, let the screen fade to black. Outside the walls of his solitude, the university took on a different rhythm. Without formal announcements or coordinated protests, subtle shifts bloomed like small cracks. In a stone foundation, Maya, whose voice had once trembled in rooms filled with scrutiny, now walked the halls with quiet certainty. She received a scholarship from an alumni fund for social resilience and ethical clarity, a newly introduced title no one questioned. Diego, still cautious in his manner, was quietly appointed as the new student liaison for campus ethics, role that had existed only in theory until now. He kept the flash drive that started everything inside a locked drawer, not out of fear, but reverence. Posters appeared in the hallways and branded, student-made. They carried no slogans of rage, only lines like silence isn't weakness when it's full of truth. Another read, what you ignore grows roots. There was no rally, no fanfare, just a shared awareness, as though the walls themselves had begun to listen. In the corner of campus where vines curled along an old stone bench, Jonathan Roumie sat alone under a slow-fading sky. The auditorium behind him stood quiet now, echoing no applause, no debates. Just wind. A student approached cautiously young, wide-eyed, the kind drawn not to celebrity but to the gravity that follows someone who's changed something unspoken. "Are you coming back next semester?" the student asked. Jonathan looked up, not surprised, just patient. His smile held warmth, but also farewell. "No," he said simply. "My lesson here is done." The student lingered, as if needing more. What was it? Jonathan paused, turning to glance at the building behind them, its pillars, its empty glass windows that once reflected arrogance, now just holding light. "Sometimes," he said, "the only way to challenge pride is by refusing to carry it." He stood, nodded gently, and walked away. No applause, no crowd, just the quiet rhythm of shoes on pavement, fading into dusk. Back inside an aging home where the light was always too dim, Granger sat at a desk with no papers, no agenda. In front of him, a single framed photograph taken years ago showed him at a podium, hand raised mid-sentence, surrounded by students who once applauded every word. He stared at it, not with anger, but with something harder to name. Not regret exactly, not guilt, just absence. As if the version of himself in the picture belonged to someone else entirely. He didn't speak, didn't move. The silence filled the room like fog, the same silence he once mocked, the same silence he had called weakness. But now, it said everything.